Action, a steering committee member of the NDP Socialist Caucus, past secretary of the Toronto and York Region Labour Council, and retired member of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We acknowledge that this gathering takes place on Indigenous lands, including the unceded territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, the Wendat, and the Haudenosaunee people. We join in the fight for justice, recognizing that there can be no real reconciliation without restitution. That entails seizing the assets of the big resource corporations and returning them to the commons. Tonight's webcast is titled The Theft of Intellectual Property of Corporations, with presenters Daniel Terade and discussants Emily Stairs, Fraser Ferenz, Siobhan O'Brien, and Basil L. Falwell. Daniel will give a talk for about 15 minutes. After that, each discussion will speak up to 10 minutes. Then we will take a few questions from the online audience. Audience members can submit a question by accessing the webcast directly from YouTube and by typing the question directly onto the chat column. Please direct your questions to a specific person, or if you want everybody to answer. If you like this webcast, please subscribe to the Socialist Action YouTube channel. If you agree what you hear during this program, please join Socialist Action by signing up on our website, www.socialistaction.ca, or just give us a call at 647-986-1917. That's 647-986-1917. So let's begin. Daniel Terade is a member of the Socialist Action National Leadership Body and a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in laboratory medicine pathology. So welcome, Daniel.
Hi, folks. Hi, comrades. My name is Daniel Terade. I am a senior PhD candidate at the University of Windsor. And for the last 8 years, I've been a scientist in training. During that time, I've published 7 research articles and 2 review articles. And what drew me initially to science was the promise of being able to use my creative faculties to improve the lives of people, whether by investigating anti-cancer drugs or studying fundamental biological processes that can then lay the foundation for future therapies. Instead, I have become alienated from academia. I'm alienated and I'm angry because the truth is, no matter how much effort I put into scientific investigation, the knowledge I generate will be seized upon by large corporations that only care about making a profit. That is why I instead turn towards community organizing, both to fill the void and to try and genuinely improve the conditions of the working class. And that is why I'm here today to talk about the theft of intellectual property by corporations, because this needs to be named, shamed, and abolished if all of humanity is to flourish. By the theft of intellectual property, I mean the theft of communal knowledge by for-profit corporations. I am less interested in talking about the theft of one company's intellectual property by another company. And at least for my talk, I'm going to focus on science because that's what I'm interested in and what I'm familiar with. So I'll begin by saying that all science is social. It begins with a research hypothesis that emerges from observations, either observations that you've made yourself, described in publications, or learned through correspondence. And this is especially true given the empirical nature of most scientific investigations today. Research builds on top of previous research. Nothing is conjured up from the ether. But this is at odds with the application of science in our world. Information is proprietary. It belongs to someone, or most often to a corporation tucked neatly into a portfolio. Drugs are patented and sold at obscene costs and that same goes for most technologies. Company secrets are the name of the game, and despite the contribution of so many workers, whether they be scientists, non-scientists, engineers, non-engineers, it is the 1% that controls and subjugates technological and scientific knowledge. The obvious problem is that these corporations are motivated by profit and not by the collective good. This is a contradiction. It is the many that develop and advance and discover, while the few and far between profit immensely and instead stifle further innovation, or stifle innovation that actually benefits people. So let's take a trip back in time. Since the time of Plato, academic elites framed science as a dispassionate discovery process and one devoid of material gain. Further, they argued that it is the person who thinks, not the person who does, that is most valuable. Of course, the people advocating this conception of science were incredibly wealthy and did not get their hands dirty, so there might be a bias there. Despite this, it is hard to separate science from this description even today. Importantly, this particular conception of science is at odds with practices of knowledge acquisition and transmission practiced by indigenous people and various lay communities. Fraser, for example, will later talk about how this tradition of collective knowledge is still practiced today within the free and open source software communities. But unfortunately, Platonic ideals persisted in universities, backed by royalty and governments until the modern day. And this is not surprising. The dispassionate science advocated by Plato is not accessible to the working class. It is communicated in esoteric jargon, if you think about how Latin was used historically, and it seeks to describe the world rather than prescribe changes. It seeks to naturalize rather than leverage knowledge for the improvement of proletarian living conditions. Further, the notion that science ought not to be performed for material gain meant that the intellectual property of scientists is collectivized in some token sense. People talk about, advancing humanity's collective knowledge, but simultaneously profited from in a very literal sense by corporations and governments. That is the situation on campuses around the world today. Although scientists and academics are imagined to live in their ivory towers, which is a fair description when you consider their ability to act as a conservative force, professors and academics are not capitalists, generally speaking. Rather, in most institutions, these people are the petty bourgeoisie. They're more akin to small business owners than ruthless tycoons, and they themselves sell their labor. But the distinction between professors and the genuinely working class technicians, lab assistants, postdoctoral fellows, and graduate students is that professors are paid a healthy salary, whereas everybody else is struggling to get by. It is in this academic hierarchy that knowledge flows up and wealth trickles down. From the scientists in training and technicians and senior scientists who work with their hands, and therefore don't deserve a living wage according to these Platonic ideals, knowledge flows up to professors who are paid well to think up new ideas as a professional scientist, but because they're scientists, they're not meant to become excessively wealthy. And then knowledge further percolates up to the for-profit pharmaceutical companies that instead shamelessly exploit this knowledge. For most of history, universities enforced a schism between academics and industry. Even 40 years ago, professors were made to choose between holding a professorship or starting up a company. But again, universities, colleges, and research institutions always expected their scientists to generate and disseminate scientific knowledge. In fact, that is the competition in academia. The person who gets the job or gets the promotion or gets the tenure is the person with the most conference presentations, publications, discoveries, awards, scholarships, and grants. They don't compete for profit. And there are some new wrinkles in how intellectual property is dealt with on campus, which is something that Siobhan will discuss during their remarks. But it is still important to take some time to discuss the incredibly broken world of academic publishing that lays the groundwork for the theft of intellectual property. So really briefly, the life cycle of a manuscript is as follows. Researchers, most often publicly funded, spend years performing experiments and analyzing data. They spend around 100 hours just writing and editing the manuscript, and then they submit it for consideration as a scientific journal. The editor will decide if it is a good fit or not, and if it is, will arrange for expert peer review, which is the bedrock of academic science. If the concerns of the reviewer are addressed sufficiently, the article is published. Now, on the surface, that doesn't sound crazy, but these large for-profit publishers, and 80% of journals are for-profit, they triple dip into the publicly funded scientific budget. Unlike any other publisher known to people, known to me, scientists actually pay to publish with journals. They don't receive compensation, they pay for the privilege of publishing. Second, the expert peer reviewers, who are often professors and senior scientists, are not paid, but are instead volunteers. They do this work pro bono, and it usually takes about 15 hours per reviewer to look through an article and provide their critical comments. And lastly, the majority of research is published in closed access journals, meaning libraries and research institutions must pay for access to the very science that they themselves produced. It's a very perverse system. Along the way, researchers transfer copyright to these publishers during the peer review process and are prevented from sharing their research before publication. This is known as an embargo period. And there are also limits on how you can share the final published manuscript. In most cases, you can't just share the manuscript that you wrote yourself and published on your social media page or on your personal website. So although the research is in the commons and accessible to pharmaceutical companies who can afford subscription costs, the public at large who cannot afford these costs, it often costs around $50 just to access one article, they're locked out. And this includes important research on disease burden, on social determinants of health, and this information is kept out of the hands of physicians, politicians, and community organizers, which is a travesty. Now, Big Pharma, on the other hand, does not like to share its knowledge. Although private investment into research and development modestly outpaces governmental funding, most privately funded research is never published at all and are de facto company secrets. This is what I meant by the unidirectional flow of knowledge into the portfolios of pharma companies. They steal the knowledge that comes out of scientific communities, and historically, they've also stolen traditional indigenous knowledge. So, for-profit publishers do not steal intellectual property per se, but they do commodify and pervert scientific communication, and they set the stage for the wholesale privatization and control of what ought to be communal knowledge. So I want to end my opening remarks talking about a specific drug, how it was developed, and hopefully this can highlight the really awful way in which intellectual property is privatized and how the masses suffer while very few people benefit. So I'm going to talk about imatinib, also known as Gleevec, which is an actual cure for a particular type of cancer known as chronic myelogenous leukemia. Before the discovery of this drug, this particular type of blood cancer killed over 70% of diagnosed individuals who would be treated with conventional chemotherapy. But there was a period between the 1960s and the 1990s, 30 years of publicly funded research performed in institutions all around the world that uncovered the molecular mechanism that underlied this pathology. Scientists, many of whom were not paid a living wage, worked to discover a new cancer-causing gene, known as an oncogene, that was at the center of this disease. This work was not dispensable, but was absolutely necessary for any future innovation by a pharmaceutical company. In fact, it was the collective work of scientists, publicly funded, that discovered a new drug target that was then seized upon by for-profit interests. So while all these scientists were working away like schmucks and just sharing all their information on the internet in these research articles, scientists at this for-profit pharmaceutical company, Ciba-Geigy, which is now Novartis, became interested in developing protein kinase inhibitors for cancer treatment. And that's not surprising because at that time, most of the discovered oncogenes, these cancer-causing genes, were kinases, including the one that caused chronic myelogenous leukemia. Now, protein kinases are enzymes that modify other proteins with a chemical tag, and this usually activates that other protein, and generally this process is implicated in cell growth and division, which is associated with cancer. So Ciba-Geigy based their designs for kinase inhibitors on kinase inhibitors that were first discovered by university scientists and just published and put out into the public domain. And they also stole the method for testing their kinase inhibitors from scientists at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. But arguably, the biggest contribution came from a scientist, Brian Drucker, who was employed at a university, and his team, who became interested in finding an inhibitor for the particular kinase that is mutated in this particular disease, chronic myelogenous leukemia. He described his one goal as finding, quote, a drug company that had a kinase inhibitor for this target, end quote, which highlights the absence of a nonprofit pipeline for developing drugs, which in my opinion is a travesty. It was Nick Leiden, a lead scientist himself at Ciba-Geigy, who sent over compounds that his team developed. And it was Brian Drucker's team who was then able to confirm the selective activity of imatinib against chronic myelogenous leukemia cells. In clinical studies, which were funded by Ciba-Geigy, imatinib proved to be even more effective than anyone could imagine. Patients taking this drug had a 90% cure rate. And now just compare that back with a 70% mortality rate. You can see how this deserves the title of a bona fide cure. And it highlights both the power of the scientific method to improve lives, but also why scientists need to rethink our relationship with pharmaceutical companies. And this is why. So imatinib made its clinical debut in 2001. When it was introduced to the market, a year-long course of the drug cost $21,000 American. Since then, the cost has not decreased. Instead, it's increased at the tune of 10 to 20% a year, peaking at nearly $150,000 American a year for a course of life-saving drug. Now, these patents did expire in 2016, but the cost of imatinib, whether the name brand or the generic, still costs nearly $10,000. And this is destructive because a patient with chronic myelogenous leukemia needs to take imatinib for their life to prevent recurrence. Even in a country with universal healthcare like Canada, the cost of generic imatinib costs the government $10,000 a year, meaning that the taxpayer that then subsidizes this drug for patients is being ripped off by for-profit companies. But there are some countries that have taken a different route. The Supreme Court of India in 2013 denied Novartis a patent extension, which has allowed the continued production of generic imatinib, which is available to patients for less than $1,000 a year, which when you compare that to $10,000 a year we're paying in Canada vis-a-vis the government, that's where we need to be. Now, in response to that Supreme Court decision in India, Novartis threatened that future innovation in India will be discouraged. Pharmaceutical companies time and time again threaten to pull the carpet out from under our feet. They demand that we allow them to profiteer or else we suffer pestilence, because as it currently stands, we're dependent on them. But why do we accept this central role that pharma plays in drug development? Because after all, they're not the ones that discovered cancer, described cancer, or chronic myelogenous leukemia, or oncogenes, or kinases, or chemotherapy, or kinase inhibitors. These are all major discoveries made by publicly funded scientists and disseminated via research articles, such that in theory, they could be accessible to everybody. So what did Ciba-Geigy contribute? Well, they invested funding to develop a panel of potential kinase inhibitors, and then they held it hostage. Brian Drucker described how even before he invalidated the use of imatinib as a potential therapeutic for chronic myelogenous leukemia, quote, it was already patented against any tumor in any warm-blooded mammal, end quote. So who is the they that developed this panel of kinase inhibitors? Do I mean the shareholders? No. It was the scientists employed by Ciba-Geigy that synthesized a chemical library that was then controlled and exploited by shareholders for profit. Those who got rich in this scheme are those that did the least labor, contributed the least intellectually, but who, through good fortune or ill will, came to control incredible amounts of capital, and who suffered the average person who needs access to life-saving and life-sustaining medications. So that is why we must fight for collective control over the knowledge produced by publicly funded scientists and indigenous control over their ancestrally transmitted knowledge. We need to fight for this. And so I'm just going to wrap up here by listing off some demands that in one way or another were adopted by Socialist Action. We demand that all publicly funded research be made immediately and freely available to the public, because publicly funded research belongs to the public. That means it's not hidden behind paywalls. We demand that all scientists in training be paid a living wage. We demand that all postdoctoral fellows, research associates, and laboratory technicians be paid a living wage. We demand an increase in the number of tenure-track research positions. We demand an increase in the federal scientific budget. We demand nationalization and democratization of scientific publishing. We demand the nationalization of big pharma and the public ownership of pharmaceutical companies. And we demand public access and ownership to their industrial, pharmaceutical, and scientific research. We demand that research groups around the world collaborate on research regarding any and all life-saving and life-sustaining medications, including a potential COVID-19 vaccine. We demand no profit on any life-saving and life-sustaining medications. We demand an end to all patents, and we demand public funding for drug discovery and drug manufacturing, and for all drugs to be sold at cost, because health and human health and access to drugs, access to medical care is a human right. And right now, pharmaceutical companies are impeding on that right, and they've shown time and time again that they deserve none of the profit that they're reaping off of the backs of laborers, scientists who are working diligently to improve the lives of humans. I thank you all for listening, and then I'll welcome any questions during the discussion period.
Thank you, Daniel. Okay, so let's move up to 400 now, Highway 400 to Guelph. Emily Steers is a postgraduate student in music at Wilfrid Laurier University, a member of the Public Service Alliance of Canada, and a member of Socialist Action in Guelph, Ontario. Welcome, Emily.
Hi all, thank you so much. And as Elizabeth said, I'm a graduate student in music at Wilfrid Laurier. I'm here in Guelph on the treaty-free territory, which is ancestral Anishinaabe and Mississauga's land. And I was part of forming a union of Laurier TAs this year. I will also be taking a similar approach to Daniel, but I will be talking about it from the humanities angle because, you know, that's my drift. So in the humanities institutions, we have a very similar fight, a fight for recognition of knowledge and recognition of alternative ways of knowing and being, and fighting to give credit to non-Western, non-scientific method-derived ways of knowing, because the scientific method is an incredible tool for a lot of things. Describing the human condition is perhaps not one of them. I personally know many Black and Indigenous researchers through the institutions I have been associated with who have utilized their position within the academy to try and discuss meaningful issues and interact with their communities on their own terms rather than as objects of white researchers' study, as has been the case for generations. White academics have, for many, many years, profited off of Black and Indigenous people's experiences, knowledge, and often their bodies. These Black and Indigenous researchers often have their ways of knowing and their ways of interacting with the community dismissed and nullified, only then to be appropriated by the universities once they are considered to be legitimized. I am going to speak to a specific experience that we have recently had at Laurier. Recently, there was a report published called Being Raced by Paige Brand, Azka Choudhury, and Joey Lee. This report was written regarding the treatment of people of color and systemic racism within Laurier, and was created by these students from the Research Apprenticeship Program independently of any external guidance. After the report was made public in early 2019, the Being Raced team was routinely ignored and their recommendations and proposals were not implemented or seemingly considered by much of the senior administration. Then, in the recent wake of George Floyd's murder and the surge in anti-racism protests and mobilizations around the world, institutions suddenly felt compelled to demonstrate their anti-racism. The Laurier administration opportunistically utilized the Being Raced report to demonstrate how the university was committed to better serving its Black and Indigenous faculty and students. They also implied that many of the recommendations of the report were in the process of being implemented, which is all completely false, and all the while not giving credit to the original authors of the report and implying that it had been internally commissioned by the administration, which then resulted in multiple other sources and other institutions crediting the senior administrators of Laurier Institution with authoring the Being Raced report. This is, of course, an egregious example that any first-year undergraduate student could tell you of academic misconduct. Pardon me. Like, we expel students for this kind of egregious misconduct. And this is but one shining example of the ways that universities and academic institutions utilize progressive and challenging research and intellectualism generated by marginalized people. They showcase this research and this knowledge when it suits their needs, but fight doggedly against it behind the scenes. This research that is focused on understanding people's material conditions and improving people's lives becomes nothing more than a PR stunt on behalf of the institutions that claim credit for it. In order to progress and in order to recognize and disseminate knowledge, of course, as Daniel said, and highlighting all of the issues within the publication industry, there needs to be a reformation and a revolution in how we disseminate knowledge and how knowledge is distributed. But also, human lives need to not be considered intellectual property. Marginalized people's lives are not for the theft and the amusement and consideration of white Western academics. to discuss and ponder. The research that we need to be doing needs to be focused on improving people's material conditions, on truly deeply understanding these conditions, and working with communities to improve them, to better understand, not to profit off of, to exploit, and then to dismiss when their concerns and their when marginalizations that decrease quality of life become inconvenient for researchers to deal with.
Okay, thank you, Emily. Now we're going to come back to Toronto. Fraser Ferenz is a member of Socialist Action and a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Toronto in the Department of Biochemistry. Welcome, Fraser.
Hello, and thanks for having me here. So today I'm going to be talking a little bit about something that is sort of ancillarily related to my research, and that's free and open source software. And so free and open source software, or FOSS for short, what is it? It's mostly in the name, but I'll explain a bit. The first thing, of course, is it's free. It's free to use. Anyone can download and use it. And it's open source. So the source code is made publicly available. So, of course, then, what is source code? And how is this different than a program on my computer? Source code is the code written by programmers to make a program that is readable by other humans, or at least the ones with the proper training. So source code needs to be compiled or translated into a binary code, which form of a program, which is, source code needs to be compiled or translated into a binary code, which a computer can understand to execute the instructions for that program. Importantly, binary code forms of programs are not easily interpretable by humans, meaning that to understand how a program works, you need the source code. So in essence, FOSS software is software that's free to use and free to understand and modify, which is the exact opposite of the corporate model, for-profit model of software distribution. So corporations are not required to release the source code for their pieces of software, and most corporations distribute a binary version of their software, meaning it is difficult to understand how it functions and what it is doing. In addition, corporations usually maintain copyright over their code, meaning that even if you could get it, you are breaking the law just by looking at it, using it, or modifying it. So in biochemistry, which is my field of study, the development and distribution of free and open source software for research purposes is a common practice. The development of these scientific tools is in large part done by scientists with programming experience or by programmers working with scientists. And the development of these scientific tools is usually funded by government research grants and therefore should belong to the public, although this does not always end up being the case, as mentioned by my colleague Daniel. However, for some, in a spirit of learning and improvement, these pieces of scientific software are made freely accessible to others, not only for use, but also for modification and improvement. I was originally introduced to the idea of FOSS through my scientific studies. However, FOSS is not limited to scientific software. A large array of community-developed FOSS programs, including operating systems, office suites, internet browsers, and much more, aim to challenge the for-profit software distribution model of giant tech corporations such as Microsoft and Apple. So over the past few decades, computational technology has become increasingly integrated into our daily lives. For many people, it is necessary to have access to the internet and certain types of computer software in order to accomplish daily tasks. It is important then to consider that, in large part, these pieces of software that the public is most familiar with are developed by corporations for profit. As a result, corporations seek to control the use and distribution of this software and to obfuscate how it functions in order to increase profit. This control has led to other predatory tactics, such as the collection, use, and sale of personal data gathered from users of software, such as, but not limited to, Facebook and Google services. Such breaches in personal privacy through the control of software, which are necessary for our daily lives, is unacceptable, and alternatives should be used whenever possible. So, I guess, how does FOSS then survive in a capitalist world? If FOSS is free and the source code is available, what is stopping corporations from stealing it for profit? Software is information. It's a complex set of instructions that tell a computer how to accomplish a task. As software is information, the rights and ownership pertaining to it are governed by copyright laws in countries such as Canada. FOSS combats the idea of copyright by utilizing what's termed copyleft licenses. So an example of such a license is called the General Public License, or GPL for short. And as an example, for example, software distributed under the GPL license or GPL must be made freely available, freely provide the source code so that anyone may audit, modify, or redistribute the software. And in addition, the GPL stipulates that any future software developed, which includes any material from a GPL license code, must itself be licensed under the GPL. This strategy ensures that FOSS stays open and free to prevent the for-profit sale of FOSS by corporations and to prevent corporations from copywriting software built upon a base of FOSS. So FOSS software is community developed. Some volunteer their time to contribute. Some development is funded through donations or government grants. Some use business models such as charging companies for IT support to fund the development of the software. And some projects are simply hobbies. The end result in all these cases, though, is software that is made available for anyone to use. It is important to consider the labor that goes into the development of FOSS, however. It is no question that developers of FOSS software should be fairly compensated for their work, for the building of these tools that everybody is able to use. However, unlike the corporate for-profit model, this is not done by restricting access to the software to those who can pay, but rather relying on those in the community with the means of contributing what they can. So I would urge people who use FOSS in their daily lives and have means to support some of these projects to do so. However, of course, the benefit of FOSS is that no one is left behind because they cannot pay, and the tools remain available to all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Are you through, Fraser?
I did have one more paragraph.
Okay, go ahead. I thought you had stopped. I'm very sorry.
Yeah, no, that's all right. So as a final paragraph, like all intellectual property, software should be free to access, use, and modify. So much information in our world is kept secret for the purposes of profit and competition. These practices are detrimental to the progression of ideas and technologies which could be used in the public's benefit. It should be stressed that FOSS is not a far-off concept, but rather that FOSS is here now, currently challenging capitalist tech industry giants. So I will conclude by saying, don't give money to powerful capitalists when community-based alternatives exist.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm sorry for interrupting you. Okay, so we're going to stay in Toronto now with Siobhan. Siobhan O'Brien is a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto in the Department of Biochemistry. Welcome, Siobhan.
Hi, and I just wanted to thank Socialist Action and Daniel for the invitation to speak today. I'm going to speak a little differently. I'm going to talk actually and tell you guys a bit of a story about my experience with patenting a discovery at the University of Toronto. So as kind of briefly introduced, I am a researcher. I'm working on my PhD, and my research centers around understanding how we can target cancers that carry very specific mutations. So this kind of allows us to screen a patient for a mutation that their tumor may have, and then select a drug that would specifically target that mutation. So this is an effort that reduces toxicity to the rest of the body, which is really common currently in cancer treatment, which is generally why people get quite sick during treatment. So this journey started actually to me as a side project, and it was something that I like to call secret science because it's something that I generally do without my supervisor knowing. It's nothing expensive and nothing he'd fight me on, but it's ideas that I kind of pursue that really kind of light the fire of research in me when I'm kind of stuck in a bit of a rut with other projects. So this kind of trip into secret science actually yielded a really exciting result. And so I did share that with my supervisor, and he was also very excited. And so then it actually became the main focus of my PhD. So the majority of the work moved quite quickly kind of after our initial discoveries. And about 6 months in, we had identified a new drug that could be useful in targeting upwards of 15% of cancers kind of across the board, but with our focus and a particular focus in cervical and uterine cancers. Along with that, we identified a potential biomarker that could be used to identify patients that would respond to this treatment, which is kind of a big hole in cancer treatment these days. It's kind of understanding how a patient will respond to treatment. So from that point, my supervisor started pushing the process of patent protection on this invention, as it's called, or discovery. So practically this meant compiling all the data together into one big file, writing really clear details on how it was all obtained and all the work that I did to kind of lead us to where we got. And then from there, we spent weeks and weeks going back and forth with a number of lawyers, ironing out literally word by word everything that was in this document so it was super airtight and we could move forward to patent protection. So U of T's patent policy, in their words, is a modern and flexible invention ownership policy, but it has two options. So at the time of creation of any intellectual property at the university, it is immediately co-owned by the university and whomever invented or discovered this technology. And this takes place, so this co-ownership by the university takes place if any of the work took place at U of T, use any type of U of T software or licensing of software that U of T has purchased, was funded by U of T scholarships, or even use U of T Wi-Fi. They own it. They own a part of it. And from this joint ownership, you can really go one of two ways. So the first way is an inventor-led ownership, which is where the cost of everything from patenting to commercialization lies on the inventors, and it's a very expensive process. But U of T still owns 25% of anything that kind of comes out of that IP. So you get 75%, the university retains 25%. The other option is called university owned, and it's where you assign your invention or discovery to the university, which they first have to review to determine if it's worthwhile. And then if they accept the assignment, which they did in our case, we went through the university-owned arm. There's a special office that's then kind of responsible for managing these expenses and revenues potentially if they come out longer term. As well, this IP office has expertise in commercializing and kind of attracting investors to these projects. So this university-owned stream nets the inventors 60% of their own invention, and the university holds on to 40% of any revenue that ever kind of comes out of this. So either way you go, the university still holds on to a pretty significant portion, and the efforts put forth by the university into commercialization is generally, as I mentioned, to acquire funding, to continually research this, really trying to attract the eye of these bigger pharmaceutical companies. And the majority of these small startups that come out of U of T are acquired by a larger company before any clinical trial is really ever initiated. To my knowledge, I don't think U of T has really sponsored any clinical trials. So whatever route you take, the end goal generally is to attract further investment so the technology can kind of stepwise be moved forward. But interestingly, if you kind of look back at the history of the university, this strategy is in quite opposition to the what's happened in the past. So as I'm sure a lot of people in the audience will know, the ability to effectively purify insulin for use in humans is a very well-known technology that came out of labs at U of T. And this was brought to the public and to public access through the now closed Connet laboratories. So a really early version of the CONET lab was put together in a local effort to standardize and produce medicine in Ontario during diphtheria outbreaks in the early 1900s, as access to antitoxin was quite challenging to get, as well as very expensive for people who were really sick. This kind of expanded during the First World War as accessibility of various antitoxins became quite limited. And from this necessity, these antitoxin producing labs were expanded. And then in 1915, really kind of got named the CONET laboratories. So the medicines produced from these labs were freely accessible to Ontarians, and later was expanded across Canada, really to have this kind of hub of locally sourced medicine that could be kind of at the forefront of Canadian access. And the success of it continued. So the technologies of enhanced insulin production, as I mentioned, which again was offered to Canadians at cost. There's no markup, there's no profit really being made off any of this. And the CONET labs were instrumental in a number of different public health measures as well. They produced locally penicillin for access by Canadians, several antitoxins, as I mentioned, as well as they were a huge part of various vaccines, including smallpox and polio, both allowing greater access to Canadians, as well as helping with international efforts of vaccine production. And this kind of all slowed down, unfortunately, in the 1970s. The labs were transferred over to the federal government. And from there, things fell apart slowly until the mid-80s, where the Brian Mulroney Conservative government privatized the labs, which basically ended its longstanding history of providing this cost-effective and locally sourced medicine to Canadians, and really slowly changing hands through multiple companies. To this day, the CONET labs kind of have that history. And what I find really interesting about this is if you ask nearly anyone at U of T what invention or discovery is probably the best well known to come from the university, my guess would be that most would refer to Banting and Best and the production of insulin. And considering the technology invented by these scientists is such a point of pride at the university, there's really little pushback to how the IP and invention landscape has changed so drastically. It's likely any successes to come out of expertise at the university today would ever leave such a mark on the history of U of T because it's so quickly commercialized and really put in front of a pharmaceutical company. When we champion these inventions, but then forget how the success was built, not only on the ingenuity and the luck of the scientists, but also an attitude towards public health and not monetization, I think that we forget and leave out quite a big piece of how the accomplishment was achieved. So with that, I'd again like to thank the organizers for inviting me, and I'm happy to take questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. My goodness, it was really educational. Okay, so we're going to move now to Mississauga. Basil L. Thalwall is a member of Socialist Action in Mississauga and works as an information technology specialist. So welcome, Basil.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So yes, Basil Fawal, I'm a member of Socialist Action and an IT specialist. I would like to thank the panelists for their concrete examples from biochemistry, humanities, software, and medicine. And I would like to start with a small intro and with Isaac Newton saying, if I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants. So with the giant, he means people like Galileo and Kepler. So if we took an example like the telephone invention by Alexander Graham Bell, there was many people working on it at the same time. And Bell himself was consulting with many people and scientists. So we need to understand that science is a social product. It is a collective product of the scientist community. Scientists cannot work in isolation. They discuss, debate, and challenge each other to help form new ideas. And as they said, it is the myth of the lone inventor or lone creator, where in most of the time the ideas are in the air and many inventors think of it at the same time. We know that corporates are not the cradle for innovation. These big giants becomes a bureaucratic hurdle to innovation. the only way they get ideas is by acquiring new companies and startup, because they have a lot of cash, and in many situations they buy the products and put it on the shelf so it won't compete with their own products, and in this way they kill new ideas and improvements. For example, Samsung and Apple went into 1 billion lawsuit for the rights of tablet computers. This is a waste of money. When corporate fight, at the end of the time, they settle between themselves the lawsuits, which cost millions, and like without any benefit to the community. These inventions like tablet, even Samsung was saying it was demonstrated on science fiction movies in the 70s, so it was not an idea of a certain company. And on the other front, since I work in IT, and as my colleague Fraser mentioned, the software industry was able to respond to this patent and copyright system. Like Richard Stallman in 1985 launched the GNU project. He developed a collection of open and free set of tools to help people develop software as a part of the GNU project. Later, this helped a Finnish student called Linus Torvald to build the open source Linux operating system, which currently used in most of the internet servers and in our smartphones and internet routers, and run in our data centers, even in buses, and everything we see now, Internet of Things, is run by Linux, which is an open source operating system. Later, there was a graphical user interface was developed for the Linux operating system with an operating system called Ubuntu, which allowed the computer to be easily used by novice people. It has a graphical interface and it runs on desktop computers, not only on servers. So, the motivation behind Ubuntu came from the African philosophy of Ubuntu, which means humanity to others, or I am what I am because of who we all are. So we need to remember that the medium we are using now, which is in our webcast, the internet was publicly funded project, the internet itself. The ability to browse web pages and the World Wide Web, the WWW, was created at the CERN Atomic Research Laboratory in Europe. Let's remember who killed the electric car 3 decades ago and stop improvements on it. Of course, for copyrights, as we mentioned, the community created what we call all Creative Commons license. So there is now, if you have any product that has CC in it, the word CC means it's a Creative Commons license, where people retain copyright while allowing others to copy, distribute, and make use of their work for non-commercial gains. So now we have really found proliferation of this type of license called Creative Commons license. We need to remember that corporates and patent system behind it is a method of killing innovation. It will delay improvements and put money in favor of human development and needs. This is why we insist to nationalize and democratize scientific publishing and abolish the patent system. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Basil. Okay, so now, thank you all. We're going to go to my producer, Kirk Young, and let's see how many questions we have, and we will put 3. So have your pen and paper in hand, panelists. So Kurt, what are our first 3 questions?
Okay, well, our first question is actually from myself. And the question is, what are the panelists' thoughts on the patenting of biological information and the attempt by capitalist corporations to gain absolute control over the food supply? The next question is from Barry Weisletter. He asks, the Communist Manifesto calls on the working class to expropriate the expropriators in terms of intellectual property controlled by big corporations today. What should workers demand? And then Ellen Ramsey asks, academic salaries may seem high relative to other wages, but I understand they are nothing like the salaries in the private sectors. Are science professors working in both sectors?
Okay, so we will start our questioning. I will tell you the order, and we have 3 to 4 minutes each. We will start with Emily, and then go to Basil, then to Chiffon, then to Fraser, and then to Daniel. Emily? Are you still muted, Emily?
I'm sorry, I am muted.
That's okay. That's okay.
Sorry, my dog was making noise. Kurt, correct me if I'm wrong, but your question about patenting biological information and the food supply, are you referring to GMOs?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So, I mean, full disclosure, am not a biologist, and I'm sure the biologists on the panel will speak to this much more effectively. But coming at it from a humanities standpoint, I think, there's a lot of fuss about GMOs and a lot of confusion and conversation. I think there is a lot of radical potential in GMOs regarding, hardier growing conditions, longer growing conditions. I think a lot of these developments are going to be really essential in ensuring the survival of the food supply chain, especially with rising issues due to climate change. The issues inherent in GMOs come from a lot of unknown information about them. The fact that a lot of the information about them is private, is the intellectual property of the corporations, and also the way that they are weaponized against impoverished farmers. You are required to buy the crop. You are required to buy a certain amount of the crop. You cannot save any seeds and try to grow it yourself. You must purchase the crop. Otherwise, you are at risk of a tremendous lawsuit, which has bankrupted many farmers I know across the world. That is, I think, more of the inherent risk. From a humanities standpoint, that is what I see as the tremendous risk, is the destabilization and monopolization of the food chain by other corporate entities, rather than being owned by the farmers and being an integral part of and in conversation with other aspects of the food chain.
Okay, we move now to Basil.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So, of course, I will just add a comment here, not specialized in the biological information, but I remember from the computer scientist point of view, there was a project to sequence the human genome. And this project required a lot of processing power by running servers. So there was 2 competing teams. One was run by a private company, and one was run by public. And of course, they try, of course, to what you call patent the human genome. Like, let's imagine that the human genome is the product of the millions of years of evolution. The company came and need to patent the human genome and make it as a copyright. This is really totally absurd, but thankful for the open source and for the computer innovations that there was a publicly funded group that were able to compete and take the lead on doing that ahead of this company. So now, if anything discovered, like any gene, any a trait in your body, it will be owned to that company. So this is why we have this system is really so corrupt that even it tried to copyright the human genome. This is really absurd. So the same thing for the food, for the nature. We know that those corporates, they look after the indigenous people. They go to they see how they cultivate, and from many like 1,000 of years of experimentation, they take it and they patent it. So they are really corrupt. We cannot trust them at all. They take advantage of the common knowledge, and we need not to like allow them to do that. Of course, I would like also to mention that, yes, the workers, as mentioned by Barry, the Communist Manifesto called the working class to expropriate the expropriators. Now, what we see in the capitalist system, we see the workers are isolated from the scientific knowledge. So there is, as Daniel mentioned, there is this gap between the scientific production and the public. People are alienated. They don't participate. Each person of us is not like a human specialized for only one person. We can work on all kind of, we are versatile being. We can do science, we can do art, we can do all kind of things. So in the capitalist system, the specialization, the isolation, this gap isolate the workers. So this is why we have to educate workers to let them part of that scientific revolution, where the capitalist system try to only exploit the technology part of science. So the science as a revolution, as an idea for change, for inspiration is removed, and only the technological part is being kind of shown and for profit only. So this is my comment on Barry's question, and I would like to I wrap up here. Thank you.
Thank you, Basil. Okay, we move now to Siobhan.
Hi, thanks. I think I'll speak a little to the third question, whether, professors or these principal investigators are involved in both sectors, and they are. So at least from my perspective, with this patent that we now own, there's potential to make money off of it. So that could potentially supplement the income. As well, a lot of professors, though, they can't necessarily, hold a position in a pharmaceutical company. They absolutely can be consultants, which can rack up quite a bit of extra money. As well, they can sit on boards, which oftentimes has a stipend that comes associated with it. And so, yeah, I mean, there isn't really a true separation of academia and industry anymore. And the ideas kind of move between them, as well as, the experts do too. So it definitely complicates things when supervisors are running these labs that are really funded entirely by public money, as well as having their own, ventures on the side with their patents and their startup companies trying to kind of make extra money or push their discoveries forward to commercialization, generally through pharmaceutical industry. Thanks.
Yay, thank you, Siobhan. Fraser?
Hi, yeah, actually, I guess if I could start by maybe also adding a bit on to the third question. So in the, I guess in my position, I'm actually not sure if my supervisor is also receiving a salary from industry. However, I do know that my supervisor's salary is listed on the Sunshine List in Ontario as a public employee, and even their public salary is very close to 5 times my salary. So this is, in some cases, an extreme disparity between the people working beneath these professors and the professorial elite. And maybe if I could comment also on the question regarding, genetically modified crops and their ownership by corporations. Obviously, I wholesale disagree with this strategy. Like I mean, having plants patented by corporations and being held, farmers being held in a legal stranglehold on whether or not they can regrow plants from seeds that they've kept from previous crops, but instead must buy new seeds from companies like Monsanto every year to grow new crops is just a hugely, hugely exploitative business model that is really just to the detriment of all mankind. And I think I'll wrap there for this set.
Okay, thank you, Fraser. Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. So since the middle question, the question put forth by Barry, seemed to have gotten the least attention, I'll focus most of my time there. I think the discussants really did answer the other questions quite well. So what should workers demand while we're expropriating the expropriators? What we need to do is democratize and nationalize basically everything, all manufacturing, pharmacy, industry, and bring under workers' control. That's what it's meant by democratization. So in that way, the workers who are working in the company, who have their hands there, they're the ones that are doing everything, and they're actually making decisions. And why is that a good thing? Well, when you have a company being run by shareholders, the only decisions are made on profit, and profit means doing everything you can. And there's been great examples throughout this whole thing so far. Basil had some great ones about buying up patents just so you can kill the innovation that would then challenge yourself. That is not something that would happen when the workers themselves are running the business, because they're going to make decisions based on the collective good in that area, because they themselves live in that neighborhood. They're the ones that live in those cities, and they're the ones that are in their communities. CEOs and shareholders, they don't exist in the same world as we do. I've never walked down the street and walked by Jeff Bezos. He doesn't live in the same world as me. That's why he makes different decisions than I would if I was there. So that's what you need to do. And then the knowledge needs to be collectivized, because obviously if you're trying to run a company for the best interest of your community, you're going to seek collaborations. You're not going to seek control. Collaboration is more fruitful. The reason why you compete is if you want to win more and more for yourself